All right, welcome. I think we're going to get this thing started. We are having a panel here that we're going to talk a little bit about regulations. And as the title of the panel, upon closer look at regulations suspended during COVID-19, as the title suggests, we're going to look a little bit at that process of the suspension of some of the regulations, talk a little bit about that, but talk more broadly too about the role of regulations and how we can do a better job maybe in reducing both the number of regulations and the harmful impact that some regulations have. We have a terrific panel here today. I'm so happy to have our guests with us, and I'm going to go ahead and introduce them starting from my immediate left. We have Representative Chris Paddie. He was first elected to the Texas House in November of 2012. He was elected to the Marshall City Commission in 2008 and was selected by his colleagues to be the mayor of Marshall, Texas. For the 86th legislative session, he was named chairman of the House Energy Resources Committee, and he also serves on the Licensing and Administrative Procedures and Redistricting Committees, and as vice chairman of the Sunset Committee, and we're going to talk a little bit about all those. He is a graduate of Texas A&M University. I'll give him a pass on that, with a bachelor's degree in industrial distribution. We also, to his left, in the middle, we have Senator Brian Hughes. Senator Hughes is serving his second term now in the Texas Senate. He previously represented District 5 in the Texas House. He has received numerous awards for his work in the legislature, including the Taxpayer Champion Award from Texans for Fiscal Responsibility and the Horizon Award from Texas Right to Life. He has been named Defender of the American Dream by Americans for Prosperity and Guardian of Small Business by the National Federation of Independent Business. He attended the University of Texas at Tyler, received a BBA in economics, cum laude, later graduated from Baylor University School of Law and served as law clerk to U.S. District Judge William Steger of Tyler before entering private practice. Finally, at the left, we have Chairman Rick Figueroa. Chairman Figueroa is the chairman of the Texas Department of Licensing and Regulation. He is also the managing partner at Patron Partners Wealth Advisors. In 2008, he was, Governor Perry appointed him to the Texas Judicial Council. In 2016, Governor Abbott appointed him to serve as a commissioner of the Texas Department of Licensing and Regulation. And in 2019, Governor Abbott appointed him to serve as the chairman of TDLR. In 2016, he served as a member of the National Hispanic Coalition for the Trump-Pence campaign. In 2020, served on the 2020 Trump-Pence's campaign's Latinos for Trump Advisory Board and serves on the Hispanic Advisory Council for the President of the United States. He received his BS in accounting and master's degree in land economics at Texas A&M University. Welcome to all three of our panelists, and if y'all would just join me in welcoming them all today. Thank you. So we're going to get started. I'm going to, I think, start with Senator Hughes, since he's sitting there in the middle at a prime spot. And, you know, I mentioned, Senator, we're going to talk a little bit about the suspended regulations, but I want to start more broadly, and since we've got a couple of legislators here, and just see if we can't get you to describe a little bit about your philosophy and your approach to regulations and ideas that people come before you and say, boy, we either need to regulate this practice or industry or back off of that, and you know, what's the role of government in general from your perspective?
Thank you for the invitation to be here, and thanks for your work on this topic. We've all benefited from it, and it's always good to be with my Representative Paddie. We go back a ways to Marshall, and they get to represent the same areas, and it's a blessing to do that. And Chairman, I've met a number of times, and I knew you'd done a lot. I'd forgotten how much till I heard that introduction, and that was just part of it. But thank you for serving and for your serving now. As far as regulation and perhaps, as I understand, we would be talking about you know, occupational licensing as part of that, right? Those limits that we place, things that the government puts in place, hopefully with good motives in mind, but the effect is limits productivity, raises cost of living for consumers. So it means fewer jobs for real people, and higher cost of living for real people. And I would stress that, a lesson that I have to remind myself of. Many of these regulations, which are high-sounding and maybe well-intentioned, and maybe they're aimed at helping poor folks, working folks, middle-class folks, people that I represent, maybe folks on the bottom rungs of the economic ladder. While they may be intended to help them, almost in every case, they're the ones most harmed by burdensome, oppressive, inefficient regulation. And I'll just say this about the source of those regulations. We understand that there are groups across the political spectrum that lobby for changes for various regulations, but one source I did not expect until I got to the legislature. Before I got here, I would have assumed that business interests, and I'm a free market guy, I'm a business guy, we believe in opportunity and free markets and entrepreneurs, but before I got to the legislature, I would have assumed that business interests would come to us and say, Chairman Paddie, we want low regulation, low taxes, you just leave us alone, let us compete, let us serve our customers. And many do feel that way. But remarkably, what we hear from, we'll have folks come to us and they'll say, Mr. Chairman, we have a really good XYZ industry, fill in the blank, whatever it is. We have a really good XYZ industry in Texas, and we are taking care of the consumers, we're doing well, but we have these outliers. We have these outliers, and they're abusing people, they're making us look bad, and it's bad for the whole industry. And you know, today we're just completely unregulated. It's the Wild West. We're not regulated at all. And so we, the leaders in this industry, we are asking you to regulate us. Oh, and we've prepared the act. You just passed this. Here it is. This is approved by the industry. You just passed this, and we'll be fine. And I confess, so many times, many of us in the legislature of both parties, Republicans might even be more likely to fall for that. Oh, the industry's for it. Respectfully, man, that's a red flag. Alarm bells go off with Representative Paddie and with me when we hear that. Because what does that mean? Well, so often, that's the big boys, that's the big players trying to keep out the competition, right? Trying to squeeze the mom and pop, squeeze the scrappers. Many times, the mom and pops who are there trying to make a living, trying to serve customers, they don't know what we're doing in Austin. They can't pay someone to come here to advocate for them. And again, everyone has the right to advocate. We are thankful for business people, for successful businesses. But while we have this stewardship of seats in the legislature, it's our job to be wise about that and not just to accept something just because the industry wants it. I remember when I met Senator Phil Gramm for the first time. This goes back a ways. It goes back to when Senator Phil Gramm was in the Senate, and Lloyd Benson, a pretty conservative Democrat, had just left the U.S. Senate. And I was meeting with Senator Gramm. I was a candidate. I was running to represent Representative Paddie in the Texas House before he got on City Council. And Senator Gramm said to our little group, he said, you know, Lloyd Benson is more pro-business than I am. And that kind of got our attention. Why would he say Lloyd Benson, a Democrat, though a conservative, he said Lloyd Benson is more pro-business than I am, but I'm more free market than he is. The point he was making was it is not the government's role to give advantage to one sector, one market participant, one player, but to create a free market, a level playing field where everybody gets to compete. Because what happens then? Then the consumers win, right? Then families do better. Everybody does better when everybody does better. So from a broad philosophy, I just wanted to stress that. We get that regulations are harmful. Even the good ones are harmful. So we have to go through a very careful process. And we should be especially suspect when the industry is for it. And I say that with deep respect to the industry. But we have to watch that pretty closely. Beyond that, I don't know if you want to go into detail. A number of regulations we're thankful were suspended during the COVID-19 pandemic.
Why don't we get back to that here in a
Good.
second?
I want to make sure it didn't go too far.
Yeah, you bet.
These senators are always filibustering.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
A terrific point, by the way, on the fact that it's lost on a lot of folks, I think, in the public, that a lot of times the regulations are brought to you by the industry that wants to be regulated for that very purpose. So that in many cases, to their credit, it's to make sure that there aren't some bad actors that are going to enter their industry and make them look bad. And so there is a safety of the public type of element to it. But there's also the element of protecting their market place and making it more difficult for others to enter that marketplace. So that is a balance there. So I'll turn that over to you, Representative Paddie, and ask you that same question. And with that, I mean, how do you strike that balance, and what do you do when those folks come to you and with those requests?
Well, thank you. And when you were asking who should go first, I guess I should have known better. I should have said I'll go first.
Oh, that's fine.
That's right. You'll remember next time.
Because my friend and personal senator, Brian Hughes, said just about all the things that I would say with respect to our philosophies. It would surprise you, two East Texas guys would have similar thoughts on a lot of this stuff. But quite simply, when you answer that question, it is about consumer protections, ensuring that there's not anti-competitive activity that's going on that ultimately affects the consumers, of course. Trying to eliminate those situations of bad actors and doing those types of things. But I would absolutely agree as well that a lot of what comes to us and at least it's packaged in a way or presented in a way that's what it's trying to accomplish. But in some cases, the effect is quite the opposite in some cases. And so, our role as members is to evaluate that and really step back and look at through the lens of, what does this mean for consumers? How does this affect the market positively, negatively, and begin to evaluate whether or not, is the consumer going to be harmed by this? Is there a need for this? You're telling me that there's a need for this because the consumer is going to be safe. I think it also leads us to our later discussion, which I found a quite interesting experiment that we've had here for a few months, where we relax some of those things. I know we're going to get into that, but I think it proves the point that we're trying to make here is that, in some cases, even though we may say they're for these purposes, they're not really accomplishing that. They have other purposes that maybe are not something that we would, on its face, support. So it's our job to make sure we're evaluating that, hearing from all points of view on it, and making good decisions that ultimately are in the best interest of the consumer, making sure we have a framework that allows the market to work and the free market to work, and for businesses and individuals to prosper. So that's our role. But it is interesting. I would agree with Brian 100% that a lot of what gets presented to us doesn't necessarily have that effect. It has a more selfish intent.
Great, thank you for that, both of y'all. Rick, let me ask you now. I'm going to turn it over to you. You've heard from these guys. They're only going to impose a statutory requirement for regulation upon the agencies once they've done their vetting. So it's not up to agencies to determine the policy of whether something should or should not be regulated. Your job, you've taken an oath, is to actually implement and enforce those regulations. How do you approach, by the way, the chairman of Texas Department of Licensing and Regulation, that's the largest regulatory agency in the state, maybe in the country. I don't know. There's a whole lot of professions, industries, occupations that y'all license and regulate. So there's a lot involved there. And y'all do a great job, and you've had a great history in reviewing and dialing back on some of those and making recommendations back to the legislature. But tell me, your approach when it comes to you and you're told, okay, you got to go out and license and regulate this profession, and you're going to have to draft, your staff will have to draft that regulation. How do y'all balance that interest that they were just talking about of trying to make sure that you protect the health and safety of the public? That was the presumed intent, but at the same time not adversely impact those that are trying to enter into that marketplace?
So first of all, thank you guys for Representative Paddie. Thank you from the Sunset for renewing us for 12 more years, and I appreciate that. My pay just doubled. I'm not 0 to 0, right?
You're welcome.
But I would tell you that you don't take a chainsaw to surgery. I think that's a mistake. A lot of political motives happen to try to do, and the fact that you have to identify and explain who TDLR is, I'm impressed. I'm proud of that. Because if people know about us, then we're not doing our job. I think it's important that we stay behind the scenes, out of the way. We clear the path and step out of the way and let people do their job. And that's important because if they knew about us, if we were on the front page of, that would be a problem. So my initiatives are to keep us behind the scenes, and it is a quiet giant. The people at TDLR are amazing. I've had the pleasure of working with them, and they have worked tirelessly. And so they're doing a great job, and the legislature, we're like a magnet, right? Fuel testing now, all the things where people see there's accountability needs to be done. You give it to us, and we're happy to do it. I think the thing that is interesting, though, is when I took this position, you know, the governor, first of all, put me on the judicial council, and I remember distinctly telling him, Governor Parrish said, look, if I don't like lawyers, judges, or courtrooms, and if I go my whole life without seeing any of those, that's a good thing, right? And he sticks me on judicial council. And then after doing a shared services there, we went to TDLR, and those guys were already ahead of that, trying to create best practices shared service, which was so impressive for a government agency that is so big, right? And so, but the beauty of this is I grew up in Bay City, government housing, youngest of 8. The tow truck drivers, the AC repairs, the electricians, these are minorities. These are people who are, this is the backbone of the state of Texas, right? I mean, I know this is a CLE, and I'm going to insult a lot of people. It's not the lawyers. I mean, God love you, but you're not the lawyers. It's the guys that clean up, fix things, make things happen. This is the backbone. People don't appreciate, I think, the diversity and the impact that you can have in communities that are, quote unquote, sometimes marginalized for whatever reasons, to your point, that aren't able to come to Austin and lobby. So it's my job as a representative for the people. I don't represent TDLR, I represent the state of Texas, the people. When I see something, I got to say something. And one of the beauties is legislators listen. TPPF listens, and that's been a 1342 was the result of that. And so there's a lot of dynamics going on, but I get ginned up about this, and because I think it's a quiet giant that can really change our state in so many ways and stabilize it in the most dire of circumstances, which has happened with this pandemic.
Great, thank you, and that's a terrific point. And the three of you, yeah, y'all do amazing work, but it's a terrific point that you just made, Rick, that all three of y'all are sworn to uphold the laws and the Constitution of the state of Texas, and you represent the public. There's not specific, you have specific constituencies at times, but it's really the public that you're trying to represent. You know, I've been listening to some of the other panels throughout the last couple of days, and there's been a lot said about how strong Texas is. Lieutenant Governor Patrick was here earlier talking about the strength of Texas, and that's certainly true. And over the last few years, Texas has pretty consistently led the country in job growth. And I was looking, Bureau of Labor Statistics reported toward the end of last year, before the pandemic hit, that Texas added more jobs, over 342,000 jobs in that period of time, led the nation in job growth for 119 consecutive months, and that was an all-time record since they've been collecting that data. Clearly, Texas was doing something right. I think as we come out of this pandemic, we saw the comptroller's revenue estimate, which I think was a little more optimistic than a lot of people were thinking. And I think a lot of that is showing that the trend should be good for the state of Texas. And I know Governor Ron DeSantis was here recently talking about how Florida wants to compete with Texas, but that's a good, healthy thing. And I think Texas is going to hold its own. How do we keep that going? And Senator, I'll come back to you. You know, we hinted that we were going to talk about this, so let's go ahead and put that on the table. How do we keep it going? And you know, one of the things that we did during the pandemic, which should be a sort of an example for, you know, more broad example about how to approach economic development and looking at regulations that matter and are necessary and not necessary. And during the pandemic, the governor issued his emergency declaration. There have been some panels talking about that, but one of the good things that came out of that, as part of that emergency declaration, was the suspension of a number of regulations because we needed them. We needed to get those out of the way for the health and medical care of the people during the pandemic, but also some of them were economic development issues. And frankly, some of them were, as we started looking, I think some of these regulations didn't just make a whole lot of sense, especially during a time of pandemic. Now, it's just a temporary order right now because it's during the time of emergency. Should we be looking at those regulations and maybe others and saying if we can get along without them during a pandemic, why do we need them, and should we maybe look at repealing them?
Well said. I think we understand at the federal level, certainly, but even in Texas, once a regulation gets in place, it's hard to get rid of it because there are these concerns. What if we do? What would happen? Would public safety be concerned? Would folks be harmed? And so it's hard to do that. And I know we're going to talk about this. I hope Representative Paddie passed some excellent legislation to give us a mechanism to review these regulations and see if we need them. And I'll say this, going further back on occupational licensing. Representative Bill Caligari, immediate not long out of the House, did some great work looking at occupational licenses we didn't need. We're still benefiting from some of the work he did. And Representative Paddie's worked on that as well. But yes, the COVID-19 pandemic, is devastating as it has been in so many ways, has put us in this unique situation where we know what life is like without all these regulations that the governor suspended, and we're doing pretty well without them. You're exactly right. So you're correct. The governor suspending those regulations during the state of emergency does not make them go away. It's still going to require legislative or regulatory action to do it. But yes, we've seen that, man, this, not only do we not need that regulation, not only are we not harmed, we're so much better off without it, whether it's expanding healthcare access with pharmacists or telemedicine, or allowing restaurants to sell groceries, or, my goodness, delivery options for food, for so many things. And again, Texas is not the worst. We still have a few silly regulations. We've gotten rid of most of them, but this has given us a great opportunity. We had a bill last session, Representative Krause and I, that would have gotten rid of about 100 unnecessary regulations, criminal statutes that didn't quite make it through the process. We may try that again, but I couldn't agree with you more. Everything that's been suspended during the COVID-19 pandemic, I think the presumption is it goes away. I think the case has to be made why we should keep it. That'd be my vote.
I think it's a great point of sort of flipping the burden on these regulations. Of it shouldn't be a burden to justify repeal. It should be a burden to justify keeping it. Kind of like the sunset process, which we could talk about a little bit more later. But Representative Paddie, I wanted to turn to you because the senator threw you a bone a second ago, and you did pass an important piece of legislation last session. I'd like you to expand on that a little. But same question to you about the suspended regulations during the pandemic, and then also talk a little bit about the creation of the Governor's Division of Regulatory Compliance, which looks at a lot of these regulations to determine anti-competitiveness before they're adopted.
Right. Well, I do think, obviously this has been a really tough time for a lot of folks personally, professionally, all sorts of ways. But being the optimist, always looking for silver linings in some of these things. And I think this is an area where we can say there's one of those silver linings, is that we all of a sudden took away that primary argument that most people have for certain regulations. It's consumer protection. Oh gosh, if we don't have this, the sky's going to fall, the world's going to end, people are going to die. And what we've seen in just about every case, if not every case, is that that's absolutely didn't happen. No one was harmed. Everyone, in fact, seemed to like it a lot. And so I think it's opened the door not only for those, but I think it leads to a broader discussion on, hey, sure, we looked at these, maybe we ought to be looking at more, and which is also kind of the idea behind coming out of the sunset process. Last time, we were dealing with some anti-competitive issues and some real concerns that originally started with a state dental board case in North Carolina that was leading to some real questions in the sunset process for us on, what do we need to do to make sure that we don't have one of these types of problems with the structures of our boards, and maybe they're developing rules that are ultimately anti-competitive. So what we have now in this new division in the governor's office is these rules have to be submitted to this division. It's now been in operation, going on a year basically at this point, to ensure to basically sign off on it. And it's kind of it's an up or down vote type thing. They're not looking to recreate it or expand it or limit it or anything like that. They're just going to kind of give you a thumbs up, thumbs down, not anti-competitive. And so that happens with new regulations, but we also made it where within that provision, based on what was already required in the government code too, as far as reauthorizing and re-upping these rules every 4 years, take a look, we put in there so those would have to, so anything currently that exists is ultimately going to have to go through that cycle, and then of course going forward this legislation catches any new stuff. And so it does give us an opportunity, a really unique opportunity to take a fresh look. And I would agree with you wholeheartedly that the burden should be on it, particularly in that process, to justify why we need to keep it. And so I think that's going to lead to a lot of good things. I think we're going to see some instances where we don't need to do some things. And I would agree with you that in Texas we do really well, and we're known for being number one in this and that. But I would still tell you that we still have a lot more regulation in Texas than some other states do, in some cases by a long shot. So we should never stop those efforts. Those should always be ongoing to look at, are there things that we're doing that we don't need to be doing, that are going to free the market to do more and for individuals to see more opportunity and to be able to live out their dream of being whatever it is. And particularly when you're looking at some of these professions where I believe in some cases it's too difficult. How you get into it and how you advance in that profession, you're limited by. In some cases, one of the areas I really, just by way of example, getting off a little bit here, but we have arbitrary periods of time that you have to do this or do that. It's not based on competency. Whether I can learn it in 6 months or 2 years doesn't matter. I don't get to advance any sooner because it says I have to serve in this capacity for 2 years. I think we need to look at things like that because a lot of times these are in professions too where we have shortages. I mean, if you look at the average age of things like plumbers and electricians and other areas, we have great needs in these areas, and we don't have a lot of folks in the pipeline in some of these areas. And so if we want to continue to be number one and all those things we love to brag about, then we have to be very vigilant in making sure that we're creating as wide a pathway as possible for folks to seek those positions and do those very valuable jobs.
Great, thank you so much for that. Rick, let me turn back over to you and just ask, you and I have spoken in the past of your concern and your passion for some of the things that Senator Hughes and Representative Paddie were talking about, the adverse impact on people trying to enter that marketplace, and in particular communities, some of the low-income communities particularly, and certain types of professions where the purported harm to the public for, if we didn't have the regulations is a little weak, and at least in relation to the, in some cases, overbearing burdens that the regulations put on somebody trying to enter into that market. We're not talking about, somebody being a, cardiac surgeon that's, we want to make sure that they, that they're properly licensed and educated and trained. In some cases, no disrespect, but we're just saying that, the level of education, the level of training, and the level of fees that are applied to some of these things are overly burdensome. Can you speak a little bit about that and some of the things that you've been engaged in to try to lower those burdens?
Yeah, so it's a balancing act, right? And I'll take issue. I mean, if you ever waited for an AC repair guy, the cardiac surgeon's falling off again in the summer of August. I want my AC fixed. I'm just telling you. So it's a relative thing, right? I mean, you're not worried about your cardiac surgeon anymore. You want your AC turned on. So there's a lot of complexities associated with that. Two things to think about, right, is when I took on this job, I said, and I told the staff, I said, two things you'll know. One, I'm okay with being wrong, and I'm okay with being fired, right? Which makes me a little dangerous, right? But I love that because I'm okay if the governor said, but I look at things with that kind of mindset, that paradigm, right? And one of the things was the prisoner reentry. So let's look on this side where we would have these AC repairs or electricians come before us, and they were incarcerated for 5 years, and they were sitting there looking at me and said, "I'd like my license back." They would tell our, and it's hard because if I give him his license, I now give him permission to go into my house with my wife or my daughter to fix the AC. So if I'm not comfortable with him going to my house, why am I going to send him to yours, right? But as a former auditor, I said, there's got to be another way to this, right? But I'm okay if he goes to a new construction. I'm okay if he goes to a commercial property because we know the recidivism rate is going to drop dramatically if I can get this guy employed, right? I go from a $50,000 liability to $50,000 asset. It's an $100,000 ROI. So the ability to be able to do that, and that's what 1342 did, in which we have more behind that. There's another look at if you're guilty of prostitution, you're banned for life from a massage therapist. Now, I know felons that have done a lot worse that we give them a second chance. But you just eliminated somebody's profession. Maybe they did it when they were 19 and they're 30. I don't know. So there's a lot of different things we have to look at. And we have to be careful to reduce those barriers. But the other side of that is the safety and well-being, right? A tow truck driver, if my wife is off on the side of the road or my daughter's on the side of the road, she's going to get in the truck. What does that look like? Who's going to watch to make sure that the stabilization of that situation. And so there is a balance that we have to constantly go back and forth. And my job is just to look at it and scratch my head and say, does it really make sense? Does this make sense? And we're attacking it constantly, always looking at these things. We're trying to eliminate programs, trying to eliminate license types, trying to figure out what it means. I take a lot of feedback from my advisory teams, right? I can't, over 40 licenses, right? I'm a boxing commissioner. Now, I'm a lover, not a fighter, just for the record, right? I mean, but how am I supposed to learn about, I depend a lot on the people that are out there every day in the advisory commissions or advisory committees talking to us and leaning into us. And I go out constantly as the chairman. I get to appoint people to those advisory commissions. I tell them, when they complain to me, I say, hey, I got a job for you. I got a job. And then they back away. All of a sudden you see them back away because they ask me what it pays. It's the same thing I get paid for, right? But those are important. So the relationship is so important. And one thing I was proud of is when we looked at this prisoner, one of them was hour reduction for cosmetologists, right? It was 1,500 hours. Now, to be EMT was 750. That didn't make sense, right? And you would be astounded at the pushback as TPPF tried to help this, right? Which was your senator, your com. I was like, where are these guys coming from? It was just a silent little undercurrent. And I'm thinking, I don't understand. And so this undercurrent, but we worked through it, reduced the hours, barbers followed suit, right? And now it's 1,000. Now, is that too much? I don't know. We can have that conversation, but it's better than 1,500 for those guys. Now, you go to those schools, and you're looking at minorities. You're looking at a lot of disenfranchised minorities who want to work, right, and want to do something to better themselves and advance themselves out of where they are. And so that's exciting to me. And I think that, so it is a balance, whether that situation where that AC repair guy gets to walk in that house, and I take that responsibility extremely seriously. Or the guy who doesn't have a chance and just sitting there because nobody's going to give him a job because he didn't have a license, right? So it's a war, and I'm excited that we're fighting that war every day.
Appreciate it.
Brian, if I could just make a comment, and I don't want to, because I don't want to miss an opportunity, because I hadn't done it yet, to praise Rick. And I think Brian Francis is one of the most top-notch people we have in state government. Does a wonderful job, which is why we keep piling more stuff on you, because you do such a good job. And so I want to brag on TDLR, and we talk about the partnership, which is a partnership. Brian and I are doing what we do from a legislative standpoint, and then we kick it over to those guys, and they're evaluating, and they're coming up with rules to make sure that it matches up. But I will tell you, they also do an excellent job of self-examining. And a lot of times, I've had many conversations with Brian before, where he'd come in and say, hey, here's some things, based on what we're seeing and the data we're seeing, that you guys maybe want to look at this. I'm not telling you you should or shouldn't, but this might be some information that's interesting to you, and maybe it might indicate that, hey, we don't need that, or maybe this could be relaxed. And so I would tell you, of all the agencies I've had the privilege of working with, I would put TDLR right there at the top as far as the job that they do of self-examining and looking at their regs and looking for opportunities to reduce those, and ultimately looking for ways to make it more, even on the license side, for the consumer, or that person's out there seeking that license, and I saw this a ton in the sunset process, where we could say, okay, we could send it over to TDLR, and man, look at these cost savings, look at these benefits, and who ultimately benefits for that? The consumers, the people of Texas, right? And so I just wanted to interject there to make sure I had an opportunity to say what a good job I believe TDLR does, and how well run it is. I would say, I probably agree at this point, that everyone has limits. And so we may be pushing up against that limit of things that we want to pile up on you, Rick, because he's not Superman. He's just a really good at his job, and so, but they do a great job.
Yeah, and I think that's a fair point, and you're right. Certainly in my experience, Rick runs a great shop over there, and Brian, as the executive director, Brian Francis, does a wonderful job too. It's a good agency, but you're right. It's like what the making of a good agency is, one, as Rick says, you got to have that attitude that it's like, look, I'm serving the public. I'm going to do what I'm sworn to do. I'm going to give information back to the legislature. Having been in that position myself when I was workers' comp commissioner, I know it's like you've got to have a two-way street with the legislative body. But so let's talk about that real quick. But while we still have a little time, is that TDLR is an example again, since you're here. You're going through sunset right now. So that's a terrific process, an exhausting process. Congratulations for getting it this far. But it's not, you got to get reauthorized, obviously, by the legislature. There's already that back and forth. But what both to you, Senator, and you, Representative Paddie, what other additional information are you expecting from the agency? At this point, most of the hard, detailed, mired in the weeds work has been done by the Sunset staff, but no doubt you've got some questions about, okay, they've done a great job, can they do a better job? Part of the Sunset report is to reduce or eliminate an additional, I think, 15 occupational licenses. Those are statutory, so that'd be, again, so how does that feedback going on those? Because, any kind of reduction sounds like a good idea, unless the presumptive weight flips the other way and say, no, we really, really need that. We've got a recommendation on the table now from Sunset staff saying those seem to be unnecessary or ineffective. So talk a little bit about, why don't we start with you, Senator, talk a little bit about that interaction and that partnership with the agency, and now you've got another agency, a third-party agency that's done this review. How can we push that across the goal line and say, yeah, let's eliminate some of these regulations? That's 15 regulations or 15 licenses.
So I'll say about Sunset broadly, and Representative Paddie has led the Sunset process. I have not, but I bet folks in this room and those watching know, but Sunset process in Texas is unique. What did President Reagan say? The closest thing to eternal life on this earth is a federal program, right? Because once they get in place, they just don't go away. Congressman Sam B. Hall, another conservative Democrat, elected to Congress in 1976, and when he campaigned, he discovered that there was a federal program where we were subsidizing the planting of spruce trees. And I'm a true story, 1976, he researched and found out why. That was from World War I, and he did spruce wood for biplanes. So they put a program in place to subsidize. We didn't run out of spruce trees, still had it 50 years since. Anyway.
But later, a spruce industry came about, and they wanted to keep that program.
Of course. The spruce lobby was pretty powerful, right? They came around and made sure it didn't go away. I wish that was a joke. I know.
That's exactly right.
So to that point, the Sunset process in Texas, where every agency must go through this process, it's not just that we have the right to, we're forced to, and if we don't, it goes away. And so what does it do? It helps us get rid of some unnecessary programs and agencies, help us combine, and yes, it helps them work more efficiently. Man, it's great. I'm sure as a former auditor, it's probably a tough process on the agency side, but man, it's good for all of us. And so again, I will defer to Representative Paddie, who's much more of an expert on Sunset, but we are blessed more than we know in Texas to have that Sunset process.
I agree. Representative Paddie, you want to add anything?
It is a great process. I've been privileged to now be going through a second cycle of it and having served as vice chair as well. It is a great process. It gives us a very unique opportunity to look at and with a stated goal of finding efficiency and looking at efficiency, effectiveness. Are there things that you're doing that maybe would be better suited to be somewhere else, or should they not exist at all? And so, but I will tell you, there's always frustrations in our process, right? I mean, certainly legislatively, we don't always get what we want, and we don't necessarily always come out having done the right thing, frankly. And I've seen that in the Sunset process as well. Some of the things that'll work its way through, we've made our decisions. We've now kicked that over to the legislature as a whole. But members are going to have some different ideas. Sunset bills are people always know that they can turn into Christmas trees, as we call them, where people begin to load them up with all sorts of things, or they don't agree with some recommendation or whatever the case may be, and the will of the body ultimately will make that determination. And even when it becomes a situation where maybe it's something that we all agree, we could have unanimously agreed that we need to get rid of that or no longer have that license. It may very well get to the floor of the House or the Senate, and that spruce lobby may be exceptionally strong, and it may not happen. And that we all remember, and I still have the occasional dream/nightmare of what happened with the plumbing board last session.
I was going to ask you for a recent example of a failure of the process, so thank you. Thank you. Go ahead.
And by the way, let me be very clear. Despite what some were trying to say out there, I love plumbers.
Of
a whole lot.
we know.
I want to make sure that they
know
continue to come to my house, and so I'm not in any way suggesting that we shouldn't regulate plumbing in the state of Texas. We had just found an example, and this involved TDLR, of course, where we felt it would be better served for it to be under the wonderful leadership of TDLR, as we already do with HVAC and electricians and some of the other trades already anyway. However, that lobby was really strong, and even on both sides of the aisle, it was Democrat and Republican. I have folks that they were hearing from their plumbers from back home because they were being told that it was going to be the Wild West and there was going to be sewer running in the streets. And so, we failed in that process, and, they'll have to come back and revisit that this time. And so it doesn't always, even though we can make a very good argument, and I could show you in paper why it makes absolute perfect sense, doesn't necessarily ensure that it'll happen because, again, back to our earlier conversation, there are interests out there who they're served by that wider layer of regulation or wherever the case may be. And so they don't want that to go. I mean, it protects them. Maybe it limits some further entrance into that, competition, that type of thing, all sorts of reasons that exist. But that can be a frustrating part of the process sometimes. But overall, it works very well because at a minimum, it makes us talk about it and re-justify in some cases while we do things.
Well, and thank you for that. And I didn't necessarily want to get into the plumbing examiners board
me either.
issue.
And I guess it's my own fault that I brought it up.
But no, but it's a good example of why, generally speaking, you want the regulation of that not to be concentrated just in a body of licensees in that industry, because while they have obviously the expertise that you need to hear from, and they have that ability to understand how best to regulate the industry, you need to have other minds there, and that's why it's important, I think, sometimes either get it to TDLR or something else, and that's, by the way,
there has to be some accountability in the process too. Again, we're getting on this example that I didn't intend to get on, but particularly when you have agencies that are going through every 10, 12 years.
Right.
And if I'm sitting there as a sunset member, as I have been the last couple of cycles, and I'm seeing agencies, the reports showing the same deficiencies in a report today that existed 12 years ago, that's a failure of leadership in all sorts of places. And in some cases, you have agencies that are so strong and maybe have that strong lobby, or as far as their folks that are in those, that they're kind of emboldened to say, hey, we don't have to do what you say because we know you can't take us out, or whatever the case may be. And so we have to look at those things and make sure there's accountability there. Most agencies, TDLR is a great example of it. They get the report and they're coming back and they're saying, absolutely. By the way, we've already done that. If it's a management issue, not necessarily a statutory change, it needs to be a management change. They're like, absolutely, we think that's a great idea. We've already done it. And you have, by and large, that's more of the rule. But we do have these exceptions out there with some of these agencies.
Rick, I wanted to give you an opportunity, but you don't have to take it. You're undergoing sunset right now. It's pending. Did you want to comment on the sunset process and how
No
it's
comment.
gone?
No comment. There's a downside on
Smart
that.
man.
I cannot echo. Well, first of all, I'm gonna pull Francis down a little bit because he's floating right now.
Right.
It's his team. I mean, I tell his team, you do the impossible. You make Brian Francis look good, which is I love Brian. He is amazing. But it's a culture, and that's what And that's what stunned me a little bit, because there's a paradigm associated with bureaucracies, right? Bureaucratic systems. There's I'm going to be waiting in line. I'm going to sit here. Some person's going to sit there and smile at me while they do a coffee break instead of getting their job done. That paradigm was broken when I went to TDLR. They really are innovative, and that culture is important. And Francis presses that constantly. His executive directors or deputy directors press it, and they press it. And I think that's one of the things that I think that we missed during the COVID. And I told Francis, I said, look, we cannot lose this. We cannot lose this because it's important. But, two rules, I guess, in politics, right? Never, ever confuse common sense with politics, right? That's just that's just the thing, right? I mean, it doesn't. So I've learned that. The second is confusion is the most powerful weapon in politics. disinformation and confusion is the most powerful weapon. And we get it with family therapists, whether it's plumbers, whatever it is. It's this narrative that gets floated around. And so I try constantly to press the staff to update Twitter, update the website, making sure people are really getting as clear facts as they possibly can. And we try to be agnostic, right? When it comes to legislature, tells us what to do. And the governor, right? You guys, so you hand it to us, we're gonna kick butt with it, right? But if you don't hand it to us, it's okay. We're gonna do our job. And so whatever you give to us, we're gonna do well. And so that's kind of the initiative we try to take. But it's exciting because as a recovering auditor, right, on Sunset, because I got to meet with them, and I got, and then as they went through their drill, I pressed them a little bit and said, examine the culture here. If we can replicate it, if we can replicate that culture, you'll solve a lot of issues that could previously be addressed, which, again, that applies that surgical scalpel within the system is a lot more efficient than a chainsaw outside the system, in my opinion.
I'm going to ask one more question before, I know we're running out of time, and I think we're supposed to go to Q&A now, but one more question while I got the three of you here, but particularly you, Senator, and you, Representative Paddie, you sounded like y'all are both kind of amenable to looking at repealing the regulations that were suspended, also looking beyond those and looking at other regulations. You, Representative Paddie, I'll start with you. Again, the Governor's Division of Regulatory Compliance that you helped create with your bill, it seems like it's working pretty well. It's limited, though, in scope. There's only a certain number of agencies, particularly certain occupational licensing agencies. Should that be expanded if it's working, and we're talking about maybe looking at other regulations? We've got the government code, as you say, that requires agencies to review their regulations on a 4-year cycle. So all of those are going to eventually come through that division if you're one of those agencies that are required to submit. Should we expand that to other agencies as well?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. It's certainly a discussion I believe that needs to be had. It is limited, and you are primarily dealing with anti-competitive actions as well, which, there's lots of things that we have, lots of regulations that we have that we don't need, frankly, in my personal opinion, but they're never going to come into question as being anti-competitive.
Right.
And so it is limited in scope when it comes to that.
Well, then if you get it out of the hands of the agency and to make that decision, or secondary decision like the Regulatory Compliance Division.
So I think we should always be looking for new ways to further examine these thousands of regulations that we have to make sure we still need them. And whether or not, maybe they served their purpose at some particular time back when we needed spruce, but we don't need that anymore. And so, and again, that's incumbent not only on us and the industry itself, but the agencies, as I've referenced earlier. TDLR does a really good job of saying, hey, we used to need this, but we don't really need this anymore. And so I look for ideas for sure. I mean, I'd be more than happy to visit more about those type of opportunities where we can further limit some of the regulation.
Great, thank you. Senator, you have thoughts on it?
We are blessed to have a part-time citizen legislature in Texas. It works well. It means the members go back home, live under the laws they made. It makes us more accountable. The downside is with a part-time legislature, and it's even exacerbated in short term limit states, the downside is we empower the bureaucracy. You talked about culture, Rick. You're so right. It means everything. So Representative Paddie passes a bill, says the agency, we're going to do X, Y, and Z. The agency will promulgate rules to implement this statute. We have great public service in Texas, and we're thankful for them. Nevertheless, many times the rules don't get promulgated, or they get promulgated wrong or half right, and we're back home making a living, getting reelected. We don't have as much staff, and so many times some folks in the agency can just wait us out. We're not going to be here forever. So whatever we can do, whatever we can do to shift the power back, not to us, but to whoever has been elected by the people, who is accountable to the people. Whatever we can do to shift that back to the elected people, not because it's me or him, but because we are elected. We have to do that.
Yeah,
I appreciate
Which I
that.
think is where that division comes in, is because we're back home at that point. We can't be looking over the shoulder of that agency the entire time to make sure that they're drafting those rules in a way that's reflective of what our intent was with the legislature. And so I think we have mechanisms like that in place. The more we have that, that's going to help with that situation.
Great. I think we need to go to Q&A while we still have a little bit of time. So does anybody have any questions? We've got one back here.
So I work for a direct primary care clinic, which is all about physicians practicing medicine with the least amount of regulations possible. And with the laws for telemed, it's greatly helped access to care for many people. But now I'm going to move the goalpost a little bit for the panel. How long do you think until we can get direct dispensing for physicians so that when you go to a clinic, the doctor can give you the medication that he's prescribing at cost?
Yeah, I'll let y'all ask that. My understanding, there's a number of states that allow doctors to directly dispense medication. That's not allowed in Texas. Again, that we could probably spend another several minutes talking about that one issue, but do y'all care to weigh in on that?
But let me just respond with a principle I believe we would apply to that analysis. We will apply to it, and that is before you take a fence down, find out why it was put there.
Right.
So if it's health and safety, we take those a little more seriously, right, than we do regulation of meteorologists. That's an important job. But so we take it more seriously, but we run our traps. And if there's not a health and safety benefit, then it's on the table. That'd be my vote.
Right. Yeah, I don't know that I have a lot more comment than that too. I think every situation is different. I'm very hesitant in all cases to answer kind of blanket questions related to certain things. Devil's in the details, right?
That's
so,
right.
As I always tell people, well, let me see your bill.
Yeah.
So,
Well, and then hear from both sides, as you said.
right,
and then you
right.
kind
To
of
understand
see,
why,
what are the pros
and obviously, but
cons,
when it comes to an access, I mean, we represent a rural part of the state that we know firsthand the challenges we have in rural Texas with access to health care. And so we're all about certainly at a minimum having those discussions and ultimately if we can come to a conclusion that it benefits the people we represent and it's good for Texas, then you can bet we'll probably be supporting it.
Great, terrific question. Anybody else? Yeah, right up here in the front.
Here, Mike's coming.
I see you. So I want to hear from you just a handful of examples of people. I know when we spoke once, you mentioned hair braiding, and I was shocked to learn that there was hours required for licensure for hair braiding, which was ridiculous to me. But I'd like to know just a few examples of some places where you have actually been able to make it easier for more entry-level workers to find work and without burdens.
So I don't braid my hair, just for the record, and let you know that. But in every station, I think we've reduced 9 different licenses, 15 programs. I mean, we're trying every time that something comes up, and it, if you look at my card, on the back of the card, it's all these licenses that we regulate, right? And so we are constantly looking at those, which ones are, and of course the legislature, but we're feeding back. And I got to tell you that when I first became chairman, I thought, weather modification, right? I'm thinking, what? And then I thought, I had no idea, right? And then combative sports. These were, and we deregulated some of the combative sports licensings that are occurring. So it is very, to the senator's point, it's very much looking at the fence, why it got put up, and figuring out if there's a good reason, then leave it there. If not, let's knock it down and move on. We were taking on one of the most heartfelt ones was the midwife license, right? I'm not a doctor, but the gravity of what we were looking at was immense, right? I mean, it's one thing when you have copper, being stolen from an AC, unit or electricity, but we're talking about the life of a baby and a mom and what that means and how to manage that. When that landed in our laps, those were something that we really proceeded very carefully and judiciously each time to make sure that we were trying to figure out what the best practices were across the nation, and reciprocities, and also getting reports. One of the situations where somebody had a criminal intent in another state, they came here and we didn't know about it. So it is a juggling act, but it's a constant conversation. And the commission that I serve with, I'm honored to serve with them. They do a lion's share. We meet a lot, and we try each time. We had a Sunset Advisory Commission that the commission went on. We have a Legislative Action Commission. We're looking constantly at legislative updates, trying to figure those out. So those are the things we're trying to do to reduce what your concern is, to make it lean and mean as much as possible. I will tell you this. I asked the staff, I said, what did we learn? What did we not do well during COVID, right? I'm okay with answering that. Again, I can be fired, right? I'm okay with that. So, and one of the things is the mail process. We couldn't get the mail the way we wanted to, and there was a lot of problems that we had. And then we had to switch to virtual inspections. So we haven't been able to inspect as much, but we had to go. But the efficiencies and innovation has caused us to really think about things that we're excited about, because virtual inspections wasn't even a conversation, pre-COVID. Now we're going to make it mainstream, which cost savings is tremendous, right? It's a tremendous move. I always say, if you ever want to find out how fast you run, get a mad dog to chase you, right? That's what we did. But do I want to run that fast for the next 10 years? No. Let's call the dog off a little bit, hopefully soon, and we can figure out, okay, we can run fast. We just got to learn, and that's the hope.
That's good.
Great question, right up here in the front. But before we get to that one, I'm gonna steal one more question, and just to borrow off of your point on efficiency. That's another area that I think we could look at, not necessarily eliminating or repealing regulations, but looking at certain requirements, even in the government code, for these, for the necessity of having hearings in person. I know y'all are looking at that even at the Capitol, but from an agency to agency, there's a lot of enforcement hearings, there's rule hearings, things of that nature that have had to go to a virtual online process. And in some cases, I think it's worked pretty well, and it's probably agency by agency, maybe topic by topic. Maybe looking at things like that just for efficiency standpoint, and helping the constituents from some of the far-flung counties in the state not have to travel into Austin to actually attend a hearing and comment. Not necessarily talking about y'all's hearings at the Capitol. Y'all could do that on a different panel. But what do you think about exploring those types of efficiencies at the state agency level for purposes of either convenience for the constituency as well as cost savings?
I'm just one vote. I'd approach it with caution, but I'd be open to it.
Yeah. Well, I think anytime we're talking about increased efficiency, we at least owe it to ourselves and the rest of the folks in the state to look at it. I do think, again, silver lining, there have been a lot of things that have come about during this COVID situation. They're here to stay. I personally didn't know what Zoom was until COVID hit, and now I'm virtually every day. It seems like I'm on a Zoom call, at least one. And the efficiency alone that comes in with that, and even from a constituent standpoint, I'll do one with my area superintendents next Friday, and whereas it would have taken, all sorts of hoops that I would have jumped through to try to figure out when I could go meet them in person and what day was going to be good for them, and where in my 6-county district would we have that meeting. So there's all sorts of stuff that I think that we're going to see. We've seen it in our judicial system. Exactly. How much is being saved from that jailer not having to load up that prisoner at the jail, drive them over to the courthouse, when they can now do that, by video conference. I mean, there's all sorts of things like that that are really good. We have to make sure, we have to be cautious in how we structure those to make sure there's guardrails there to make sure that we don't have any unintended consequences. But overall, it's
or at
presented
least
some great
maybe
opportunity.
making it available on a voluntary basis for that purpose. But just things we could explore, I think, down the road.
But I'll just real quick.
Yeah, go ahead.
People learn. I mean, I'm 51, so I'm an old guy, right? But people learn differently now than we did back then. The classroom, the virtual nature of the classroom is something that's very common. And as people get more comfortable with that, I'm a more three-dimensional guy myself, but that whole virtual learning and judiciously, but that's something we're going to. And for a AC repair guy who lives in Amarillo to get to Austin, and maybe he has that option to do it virtually, could save him some money. We want to look at that, and we're examining that. So that's a big deal.
Representative Paddie mentioned, excuse me, about the plumbing board lapsing, and the governor said that he had the authority then to let it continue. Is that true?
It appears the governor thinks it is. I'm not aware of any challenges that result in anything differently than that. Obviously, I know there was a big question about that, and some of those more emergency powers, frankly, that were invoked to be able to do that. And so that certainly has been a discussion. Don't know if that's a discussion people want to have further. But they're kind of in a situation right now where they've got some time bought here, but come, I think, sine die is when that expires. And so they're going to have to proactively we are going to have to proactively do something by the time we sign it out in this session, or they will be abolished.
Folks, we're out of time. Thank you for that, and thank you for all your questions. I did fail to mention at the beginning a couple of things. This is CLE accredited, this panel, so if you want to sign up for any of that, there's a sign-up sheet right there. There's also an online, if you're joining us virtually, some kind of a QR code that I'm not familiar with. If you have any questions, contact events@texaspolicy.com. For more information about this topic and look at some of the research that we're doing, get on texaspolicy.com and you can get all our research access. Thank you very much. Join me in thanking our panel members. Thank you very much, and I think it's been a great panel.